Hello and welcome to Building High Performance Cultures, a weekly series where we talk with executives from top organizations about how they've built high performance cultures and how they're leveraging culture as competitive advantage. I'm Marty Parker, the President and CEO of Waterstone Human Capital, and my guest today is Alim Somani, a recognized and respected global leader, and I would say visionary, in both the IT business and the business community in general. Alim, welcome to Building High Performance Cultures.
Thank you, Marty.
Great to have you. And a little bit about Alim. Alim helped found Infusion, which is an award-winning technology and design solutions provider, straight after graduating from university. And he spent the next 16 years as Infusion's president, where he oversaw the growth and strategy. And Infusion grew from very little to more than 700 employees worldwide, and really had a top roster of Fortune 500 clients. And in 2017, Alim led the process that culminated in Infusion's sale to Avanade, a 30,000 person technology consultancy co-owned by Accenture and Microsoft. Now, more recently, Alim is about to take on a new challenge leading the digital practice at Hatch, a global network of professionals supplying engineering, project and construction, business and consulting operations services to the metal, energy infrastructure, digital and investment market sectors. Now, most interestingly, in 2014, Alim became the inaugural winner of Canada's Most Admired CEO Award in the growth category. So Alim, although I want to talk a little later on about the new role at Hatch, maybe we can really start with the story of Infusion. And for those who aren't familiar with the organization, maybe you can start by telling us a little bit about the culture and the business there.
Sure. Well, I think it's important to understand Infusion's history and who we were, a little bit about how I stumbled upon and joined the company. So I'm a University of Waterloo electrical engineering graduate, class of 2001. And as many of you may know, Waterloo is really well known for its co-op program. So students spend 4 months at school, 4 months at work. And around towards the end of my degree, my roommate and I accepted a job at Infusion. And Infusion at the time was a 6 or 7 person consulting company focused on financial services. You know, they were doing a lot of work at the time for Lehman Brothers. And most exciting for us was that they were based in New York City. So for us, as much as we cared about who the company was, we really wanted to spend 4 months, living and experiencing New York. And so, we packed our stuff into my 1992 Jetta and made the trip down to New York. It should have been a one-off. And we worked down there, and we really hit it off with the founders. So the founders, our CEO, Greg Brill, at the time if we were in our early 20s, he was in his late 20s. It was him and his wife, Deborah Johnson, who had started the business. And, we thoroughly enjoyed our time at Infusion. It was a different kind of company, a different ethos. We weren't treated as students. We had a seat around the table. But probably the most critical thing, and I think it really helps, lay down what the culture of Infusion was. Towards the end of our term, Greg sat us down and said, "Do you want to come work for me? This was the height of the .com boom. No one could find talent. Guys, do you want to come? Finish your school. Don't finish your school. I kind of don't care." And we turned to Greg and we said, "Nope, no, thank you. We've loved being here. We've loved the experience. We're better for it." But two things. One, we're Canadian and we've both lived in the U.S., but Canada's our home, and we want to be established in Canada. And two, we're entrepreneurs. We're going to start our own firm when we graduate. Now, we had no idea what we were going to do or how we were going to start it, but this was a time when everybody that knew technology believed they could start a multi-billion-dollar company, and we were no different. And really, that should have been the end of that. That should have been the end of our time at Infusion. But Greg and his wife, Deborah, sat us down a couple days later and turned to us and said, "You know what, guys, go back to Waterloo. We have a proposal for you. Instead of waiting until you graduate to start your own company, start one now. Start your own company now, and we will be your first customer. We will be your first client. And you know what? We have some overflow work that needs to be done, but maybe this gives us a chance to keep in touch and do something different." Now, the reality was we were students. We would have done overflow work for Infusion for pizza and maybe $10 an hour, but they treated us like a real company. And we set up in our basement. Sheldon and I set up a company called S Squared Solutions in our basement. And we serviced Infusion and a few other clients. And then during our last year of school, Greg came up and said, let's build something together. Let's set up a Canadian branch of Infusion. And that was the end of that. It was a no-brainer. By then, actually, the dot-com bubble had burst. But that mindset, the way that we were treated by Greg and Deborah, the way that we were, they could have easily hired us over the school term for $10 an hour. But whether or not, Sheldon and I, S Squared Solutions, it was small, we started to think differently. We started to think as, CEOs and business owners. How are we going to build our business? And that was the mentality that we had coming into the firm. And so the culture that Infusion had from the very beginning, the values were all about, the market overvalues experience at the expense of attitude and aptitude. And that if you can get a bunch of smart people together with great attitudes, and you can empower them, that's the recipe for success that the market doesn't recognize. So that's what got me to come to Infusion. It was that founding principle that, and I remember Greg sitting down with me when I was 21, 22, saying, you could be the president of this business. It could be yours. You could be an equity partner. And all those things came true. And that was very much what Infusion was all about.
So really interesting. What a great story. I've heard it before. It never gets boring. And so because it's an entrepreneurial type story, or entrepreneurial. But I have to ask you, Alim, when it came to those early days in Infusion, was culture a part of the startup conversation, or did it come later?
It was absolutely, I don't think we sat down and said our culture will be, but we were this little 7-person company that then grew to 20 people, that then grew to 40 people, but we always punched above our weights. So we started from day one, and it wasn't like we were this little company doing work for Joe's Pizza saying one day I'll do work for the big boys. From day one, we were, and we were doing work. Lehman Brothers was our client. Credit Suisse were our clients, and we were writing real serious, big person systems for them. And so we were not the little company wallflower. We punched way above our weight. And so the conversation constantly around the office was, how do we, we had this belief that we were smarter, that we were willing to work harder, and that all that we didn't have was, the fancy signs and the numbers that, say, an IBM would have or anything else. And we had swagger. And that was a big part of it. And it was a big part, in our business, and I'm sure we'll talk about this later on, there's no supply chain, there's no factory, there's no, it's a human capital business. And so, as much of our success was our ability and determination to make our clients happy, but was our ability to find like-minded people and say, come on this journey with me. You're the smartest person in your boardroom, but you're the most junior person there. Here, that's not going to be the case. We're going to go and solve real problems, and you're going to have a chance to, to be at the. So it was just, culture wasn't something it was just who we were, but we recognized from the very beginning that was what was differentiated about us.
Now, how did that, let's call it, that differentiation of your culture, the behaviors that made you you, how did that evolve or change as you became startup to more established and upstart to, on those curves of the corporate life cycle, if you will?
It's a very good question, and it's probably only in hindsight, on reflection, after having been acquired by a much big company, that you really understand what culture is and what it isn't. And so I think at its very core, so I think if you'd asked me when we were first starting, one of the things we would have said, when we were 10 people at a staff meeting was, we're a different kind of consulting company. We promise you're never going to have to do that bureaucratic stuff like fill out a timesheet. We're just not that kind of company. Easy to say when you're 10 people and say, that's our culture, right? We're renegades. Get to 50 people where you're doing work for, 20 different clients, and get to 100 people, that became something that, guess what? People had to fill out timesheets. And understanding that, no, that our culture wasn't that we didn't fill in timesheets, right? And at least what we realized was, what's important is values. And at the basis of any culture, culture can change, and that's okay. And culture can evolve, and culture can mature. And I would actually argue that it needs to, as an organization, changes and matures.
Yeah.
And the culture that we had on day one when we started Infusion was different than when we sold at 700 people. And it's different than the culture that Avanade at 30,000 or so people has. And that's different than the culture that Accenture, their parent company, at 400,000 people has. But what remained constant at Infusion was we had a set of values that was increasingly important. That conversation that Greg looked at me not as some college intern that was smart, but instead as, hey, this could be a business partner. This is someone that we're going to build a business together. This is someone that I'm going to help grow, and he's going to empower himself because he's ambitious, and he's going to pass that down. That was part of our values. And from values, you have to decide, you have to build a set of behaviors when you're running a business that are consistent with those values, but that also suit the time and place where you are with your business. Right. Mm-hmm. So when we were 10 people, having a behavior that said, we're not asking you to fill out, time cards because that's bureaucratic and we want you to focus all your time in doing well by the client. That was a behavior that was consistent with our values. Now, when we got to 500 people, hey, we had other behaviors that were consistent with our values. But the behaviors can change. And as the behavior, and then when you choose the behaviors that are consistent with your values and you repeat them over and over again, that's what makes your culture. So your culture can change over time and it can evolve, but what's important is that it's grounded in the same values. And you can have two organizations with different cultures that are not grounded in the same values, and they're very different organizations, but it's part of a continuum. I think that, cultures can evolve as long as the values stay constant. So, we went through our culture evolved, our values remain the same. But I would say if you looked at our late culture compared to our early culture, it was still recognizable, right? It was still consistent. And if you grew with it, you'd still feel very comfortable and it wouldn't feel, out of sorts.
Well, we're having lots of conversations now and doing work around the fact that culture is now changing on organizations, whether they have asked for it or not.
Yeah.
Because of what has occurred. We're seeing a paradigm shift in people working remotely, which requires different behaviors, which requires different systems, which will evolve culture. The real question is, do they have the values that will support that change?
And that's precisely it. And I think COVID is an accelerator of a bunch of things that are going to force us to change our behaviors. And what organizations have to think through is, how do I change those behaviors, not just knee-jerk, but in a way that's consistent, not just with the business realities, but with our values, right? And I think whenever people talk about generational shifts in businesses, oh, how do you manage millennials, or how do you manage Gen X, or how do you manage this? It really needs to come back to people not being afraid to change their behaviors, but holding their values as immutable, right? And you've got to make sure your values resonate with your employee base and resonate with your recruiting and talent acquisition approaches.
Yeah. So we're fast forwarding a little bit, but Infusion, later Avanade, became a global company. You went from this intern to this young graduate to a leader of a domestic, continental, and then a global company.
Yeah.
So talk about some of the challenges of managing your culture and your operations within that culture on a global scale, and what were some of the, looking back on it now, the kind of key learnings?
Yeah, I would say and Marty, we've talked about this before, but I would say, and I actually think there's a business school case study written on this very early on, in our company history. So we start the business I join and we start the Canadian business, and that was April 2001 when I graduated from school. So of course a couple, a big seismic event happens in September 2001 that has reverberations that carry out for a number of years, which is 9/11. And so all of a sudden our core business, which were large financial services clients, go through this enormous shock. And one of the big reverberations of that years later is this push, the pressure that these financial services companies were facing around costs, and this desire to do outsourcing. And so, at the time when we were just starting off, like a lot of small businesses, 80% of our business was coming from Lehman Brothers. Thankfully after that we diversified for reasons that the next big shock, kind of took care of. But at the time, 80% of our business was coming from Lehman. And yeah, we had a diversification strategy, but we weren't there yet. And in 2002, the CIO of Lehman, so our kind of protector, stood in front of a town hall of all of his IT, staff, and said, "We are going to India. We've been mandated to move our department to India, and we've signed deals with Wipro and Tata. And our aim is to shift, X%, some inordinate amount of business to India." And then he looked at all of his full-time employees, a little unbeknownst to him, or maybe he didn't care, but there were consultants sitting in the room. He said, "But we will prioritize your jobs by cutting our domestic consultant workforce first." So talk about an existential moment as a business, right? You sit back, you're starting up, 80%, your client that's 80% just announced at a town hall that his strategic mandate was to move to India. And the way that he was going to do that was he was going to cut your business, which is pretty much all your business. And so we sat back and, we called him up and we talked to kind of our gurus, and they valued us, and we were a rounding error at the time. And his message to us was, "Listen, things are going to India. We want to continue working with you. So if you're in India, we'll keep working with you." And we set up a business in India. We moved very quickly, and we set up an office in Bangalore. And a year later, we shut it down. And we recognized a few things. One, when we went into India, everything then was about CMM level development, capability maturity model, which was this process that NASA followed and everybody wanted to follow. And so we said, okay, we have to be a CMM level company. And we hired people there, and we realized that we as Infusion, a small company, did not have any competitive advantage in India around talent. Our whole value proposition was that we could get better talent. Our whole value proposition was that we led with these values of empowerment and entrepreneurship, and you could be the president one day and everything else. We didn't find that in India. We didn't actually look for it, but everybody was moving to India. So we ended up shutting down, the Indian practice a year later. We shifted all the work to Canada. The Canadian dollar was lower. We made a little bit less margin, but guess what? Our clients still valued us. Lehman didn't stop working with us. We actually grew our business, and we actually became real pioneers of Wall Street nearshoring in Canada. And that practice grew, and we ended up doing work for a number of major institutions. And we said at the time, never again. We will never do outsourced work. We'll never open a center somewhere else, and et cetera, et cetera. Fast forward to 2011, right? We're now a much bigger company. We're doing much bigger projects. We're doing 7, sometimes 8-figure projects. And the knock that we're getting for our clients is, we love working with you, but you don't have a way to scale with us from a cost perspective. So we're fine giving you the first $1 million, but you're never going to get the 10 million because we need, you don't have a price point. And so we revisited that statement that we made, that we'll never outsource, or we'll never open somewhere else, or we'll never do that. But we sat down and we said, let's learn from our lessons in India. And we said, so we built a matrix of the countries in the world, and we valued countries very differently. And we said, we went in with a culture first lens. And we went to Eastern Europe, and we went to Poland. And here's what we found in Poland. Average tenure in a job, this is now almost 10 years ago, so it's changed, but people didn't leave their jobs. 6 years. Everybody spoke English. But when you spoke to the people on the ground, they were a little bit suspicious of authority. And Marty, you know me well. I'm a little bit suspicious of authority. They didn't like this history that had been in their country of everybody outsourcing to them. They wanted to be at the forefront of innovation. They wanted to be the ones kind of, they didn't want the back office work thrown to them. And they wanted to be able to define their own cultures, and everything. And you had this place that was just vibrant, and it was more expensive than India or the Philippines or whatever, but they were our kind of people. They shared the values. Now, if you walked around our Poland office, it would feel like a different culture, but ingrained there is the same values, right? And that's what made it work, and that's what made it consistent.
Now, is it tough question, I recognize, but in your experience, Alim, is it reasonable to expect your culture to help to allow you to scale globally, or do you really have to address and make accommodations for culture, not values here, on a region by region basis? I'm talking about corporate culture.
Yeah. Yes. So I think, and we've now talked a little bit about the distinction between values and culture. And I think one is you can't compromise on your values, and you need to insist on them, and you need to lead on them, and you need to be listening for them. And if you don't see them exhibited, and everything, you need to step in as a leader and make changes, or you need to not bring the person on, or you need to, if you don't believe that your values will resonate, you need to not do business with that place. And sometimes that goes for clients as well. There's times when we are a very client-first organization, but there's times when things fail because there just wasn't an alignment of values. Now, culture is interesting, and you and I have also talked about this. I think there's a concept in business of having large organizations having monocultures, right? You often hear, and this is probably not fair in current times, because I'm sure they're a different organization now, but you hear traditionally about the IBM, right? The guy in the blue shirt, and if you work at IBM, you're a certain kind of person. Or even look at companies that, I think, a lot of people admire McKinsey, and I admire McKinsey, but to work at McKinsey, you have to be a certain kind of person, right? There's a McKinsey type that you or I may or may not, we may be very successful and brilliant in our own ways, but we may or may not fit that. And if we don't fit it, it's not gonna work there. And I think there's some very successful monocultures out there, but I believe the real opportunity to grow and scale and do broad sets of things is to actually have a polyculture. And so to have, to allow for, different cultures to emerge that are rooted in the same values. So, and they can have certain elements that are common, and sometimes it's important for certain elements to be common, but I think that's a powerful thing. I think I appreciated that. One of my American colleagues said to me once, he said, look, like, you take for granted the fact that you're Canadian, and in your head, maybe you think, oh, you're Canadian, it's not that different than Americans. But he said, Canadians are cultural chameleons, right? And you're used to you're naturally empathetic, you're used to adapting to different cultures. So I think in some ways it came a little bit natural to the Canadian leaders in our business, but there's no way, I don't think, you can have a company succeed where people are thriving and loyal and building in a location like, at our peak, we had offices in Dubai, we had offices in Poland, we had offices in London, we had offices in Texas, we had offices in Toronto, all over the world, where the culture is exactly the same. Now the values have to be the same, but the cultures can change differently. And then the key is, the magic is, and this is where I think, a big part of it for us was we recognized we're a human capital business, and we recognized that it was about hiring and recruiting the best people, and our values were all about empowerment. Empower yourself, do right by the client, grow yourself, and if you're following those things, good things will come. How do you allow that talent how do you create a culture that's, that takes into account, that's grounded in your values, that takes into account the needs of your business, but also the individuals and their cultures of where they're coming from, to get the best out of people?
Now, Alim, the tech field continues to be a sought after, field, both for team members, the best talent. There's always a competition out there for the top people. How were you at Infusion and Avanade later on able to kind of not only attract, that's a challenge in itself, but retain the right people under those circumstances?
For us, it was always around, having a message that you could have accelerated growth at Infusion. You could have accelerated growth. You could have accelerated experiences, that you could do your best work here. And so when we lived up to that, and when we were able to deliver that, and when you do that and you live those values, you then get the legacy of having a bunch of people, right? Like a class of people that have joined 2 years before you, that have had 2 years of experience in that become your mentors and your guides and everything else. So I had that, I had great mentorship from Greg and Deborah. I think there's a crew of people that were my folks that had great mentorship, for me, and then they had a crew underneath them. And so for us, that was very much our value proposition that tied into our values. And we were able to bring in people when we spoke to that. We were able to retain people when we lived to that, and we lost people when we didn't. Right? When it was difficult for us, and sometimes that ties into the business reality. In our business, doing that well produces growth, and growth allows you to create new opportunities for people. Right? And so and so we were successful because we were able to to do that well.
So not only did you do it well, in 2017, Infusion sold Avanade. It was a big success, but I know you played a big role not only in the sale, but probably more importantly for both organizations, on the integration, of the two businesses. So, in doing that, how did you address the bringing together of these cultures, both as part of transaction, but also
Yeah.
in the real world as you were integrating these two businesses, cultures, and of course values together?
Yeah, I think I think there's a few things, strategic and tactical, as well as a lot of lessons learned. So I have to say at the outset, probably the hardest thing, or I should say probably the hardest thing, in selling the business, and it was a successful sale both for us but also for Avanade, and it was a successful integration. I think if you were to look at Avanade and even Accenture that acquires companies, feels like weekly, but they're an old pro at it. I think you would look at the acquisition of Infusion as as a success, if not one of the most successful that was done. But I would say the hardest part was cultural integration, and the thing that I as a leader probably underestimated the most was the difficulty of that. But I think but having said that, it went well, right? So it went well if you were to judge it by the standards of acquisitions, but it was still a challenge, and by no means did it go perfect. And so I think the first thing was we were deliberate. I remember hearing I remember hearing the story, because we sold the business at a time when there was a lot of transactions happening in our industry, and so when you'd meet other owners of businesses, you'd hear their stories of either selling their businesses or being approached or whatever. And I remember we had a competitor that was similar to us that operated in a different region in the U.S. and they had sold their business, and it was a big news. And they had held an auction, and they'd auctioned off their company, and they said, yeah, we did a blind auction, and we had a bunch of bids come in, and then we negotiated with the highest bid. And this was a company similar culture to Infusion, similar kind of ethos, and they sold their company to a company called Chinasoft. And you could imagine the images that kind of Chinasoft conjures in your head. That's who they sold it to, right? Kind of they were going to be this little arm of this large faceless company with thousands and thousands of of people. And in my mind, yeah, you know what? We were building a business at Infusion, and at some point, there was going to be a transaction, and that mattered because that was a big asset. But this was also, our life's work, and this was also, these were people that had entrusted their careers to us and everything. So for us, it was really important to find an organization that was a strong values fit. And I'd known the team at Avanade for years, and I'd known people that had gone and worked there and everything. And so we only entered into serious discussions knowing that there would be a strong fit in value. So that was one. Now, when number two, and this was a tactical thing that helped, but Avanade is 80%-ish owned by Accenture, and they were going through their own transformation. So one, they were the IT business in general was transforming, and they were transforming to become a company that did less kind of IT managed services and more creation, and more custom work, and more digital transformation. And that was a strength of Infusion. That was something we did well. And so when they bought us, they were also looking to learn from us. And I think that makes a difference, right? So they came in kind of with this growth mindset about the acquisition. And then, the other thing which I would say is tactical is they were also at a stage where they were trying to form their own brand and identity separate from Accenture. Not separate, but kind of, what was Avanade versus Accenture. And so up until that point, for the most part, they had co-located in offices with Accenture. And so after the acquisition, Infusion had offices around the world. They physically moved into most of the locations where we had offices. So the office in Toronto, that was an Infusion office. The headquarters in New York was an Infusion office. The Houston office is an Infusion office. And whether it was deliberate or osmosis, that a lot of Infusion's culture manifests itself in the offices, right? We had events, people came together. And so there was this kind of, people valued what they saw, and they became that. So that was a big part of the success. Now, some of the challenges, I would say, come back to what we talked about earlier on. You have a set of values, and then you build a set of behaviors that are tied to those values, but also map to the realities of your business. Mm-hmm. And, and those oftentimes are a factor of size and scale. And this seems like this seems like a really kind of, and so a big part of it was there, so that was a big step function for our employees. So when you grow from kind of 10 people to 700 over 10 years, those behaviors that you need to change happen gradually. When you go from a 700 person company to 30 whatever thousand person company, that has some policies set by their 400,000, it's a big step. So, there were some people that said, this doesn't feel like what I signed up for. And so some of that was people, my message to people was, listen, don't, that we didn't have key cards to get in the door and now you need key cards. That's not an indication of a change of culture, right? Like that's not a reason, there's practical reasons, give things a chance. There's similar values. And, it was important for me to establish a platform for our talent to be seen. But my message to people one-on-one was give it a shot. And after a year, there's people that decided that it wasn't necessarily the culture that wasn't right for them, but they didn't like working for a big company. They wanted to work for a smaller company, and that's okay. And everything. So I think there was similar values, but I think sometimes the frustration came in the step up change in behaviors that are just required to run a larger company.
Yeah, understood. So you're, entering a new role in a new organization at Hatch. What lessons will you take kind of from this 20-year culture and growth journey into this new role?
Yeah. Well, I really look at, so I, as you mentioned, I was at Infusion for, 16, 17 years before we sold the business. And I think for me, that was a masterclass in entrepreneurship, we did a lot of things, we failed at a lot of things, we succeeded at things, we built on things. And so I felt very comfortable, if you're, being entrepreneurial. And I felt very comfortable kind of as in my own skin in that size of organization. When we sold Infusion, we were, like you said, 700 people, roughly, 100 million-ish in revenue. I was very proud, and I thought we were running a very big organization. I would say that the 3 years that I spent at Avanade, for me, were an MBA in learning how to scale a business and what it takes to, when you're running what I learned now, 700 people is not a big business. Generously we could call it a medium-sized business. But what does it take to do something at $1 billion scale? And it requires, I want to say, you need to learn how to, I spent the past 3 years, for lack of a better analogy, learning how to work out different muscles, right? Or going from, being, kind of a sprinter to a long distance runner, or whatever the right analogy is. And I think what I'm bringing to Hatch, so Hatch is, probably similar scale to Avanade. It's, I believe it's somewhere between, $1 billion and $2 billion in sales or revenue. And so I look at myself now as someone who's bringing in that entrepreneurial mindset, but also with that knowledge and awareness of how to do things at scale and at maturity. And so, I think there's a way of hopefully bringing those things together.
Should be a lot of fun.
It should be.
I know we're undergoing a lot of change right now, but what trends do you see, or foresee, probably is a better way to say it, coming in terms of building high performance cultures? Now, they may be new, or they may just be continuations of things that we've seen before. But what do you see as kind of the trends in terms of continuing to build culture to drive performance?
Yeah, I think one of the trends that we were all seeing, but it's been massively accelerated by COVID and everybody working from home, is this kind of the future of work, people working remotely. Mm-hmm. And I think I think quite frankly, before COVID and before this quarantine, we all underestimated the cultural change that it would bring to business. And I think we've all now kind of 8 weeks into it started to recognize that, oh, it's not just about making sure you have good internet bandwidth and that your kids aren't being noisy in the background. There's a difference in interaction. And so actually, when I even look at myself joining a new company, even though it's a long commute for me, there's a real part of me that's hoping that we're back to some semblance of kind of normal and in the office. I think it's going to be a massive challenge. How do you build a culture of, it's one thing, Marty, even this conversation, I've known you for years. So, us talking over Zoom, it's not optimal, but we've got a huge well, to draw from of personal interactions and energy that we've exchanged. How do you do that? How do you build a culture where everybody's remote? How do you have the by the way hallway conversations that generate the next new idea? How do you pop into someone's office and say, do you want to go to that coffee place a block away and talk about their career development? And I worry about that. I worry about that, and I worry about that as a source of innovation. I worry about that as building loyalty and loyalty to brands and companies. And I think we need to think that through. I don't think it has, and I think an organization can do without it for a little while tactically. But I think digitally there hasn't been the equivalent of it's a big disruption if someone calls you on Zoom or calls you on Teams, right? And says, hey, I just want to, I just want to shoot the breeze for a few minutes and chat about. But someone passing by your office and getting the social cue that, oh, Marty's checking his email on his phone, and I can walk in versus he's in the middle of a meeting. I worry about that. And then I think we shouldn't kid ourselves, right? If this trend will accelerate, business travel will get reduced. I also think if the supply chain changes and everything, if you and I can work remotely, businesses will be under pressure to cut costs. So if you and I can work remotely successfully, what's to say that we both have to be in Canada? What's to say that one of us can't be in India or Bangladesh or the Philippines or somewhere else? Okay, and if that's the case, that's fine. But now you're trying to build a culture where we both come from different cultures, but we don't have the benefit of any interaction or any kind of common chains of human interaction. So I think that's going to be a big challenge that we need to, and it's going to have an impact that we need to think through.
Well, it's already happening. We're involved in discussions where people are saying my culture is changing, so I want to curate and get ahead of it. What's the workplace going to look like? How do I maintain my values? These are all good things. We don't know all the answers yet. How do you create hallway discussions? How do I develop trust? How can I, when I'm doing it digitally, which is hard enough to do so these are, there are more questions than answers today, but I'm also of the view that as much as this changes, we will get to a point in time where we'll want to connect, and we'll find the way. Yeah. Whether it's in person, Agreed. Whether it's digitally, we'll find
Agreed.
a way.
Agreed. I think it's a human need. I think it's a human need, and human organization depends on it.
And culture is actually going to be a bigger differentiator now, because those who can figure out how to apply it are going to take advantage of it. So I think it's stronger. So let me ask, you've been in a culture of mentorship. You've been a mentor. I know those you've mentored. And so what's one piece of advice that you'd give to someone today who's coming out of, coming out of the University of Waterloo, coming out of Ivy, coming out of UBC, coming out of Harvard, Penn, any school that is looking to start their high performance leadership journey in terms of, a high performance culture? What's the one or two things that you'd tell them?
It's interesting. I've been reflecting on that, and I don't think there's a nugget or an insight that I picked up over the years that's as good as the one that, Greg shared with me when he started the business, right? And I think, at least in a business where you're building around human capital, which I believe is a lot of the businesses, and most businesses, if they're not thinking that way, need to, or they won't be in business long. I think the market still overvalues experience and undervalues attitude and aptitude. And I think if you're a leader and you're building your team, spend time with the people with the right aptitude, spend time with people with the right attitude, and have the patience to teach them the domain that they're in, or make up for their lack of experience, or be that safety net underneath them. I think it's sometimes in the short term, it seems more efficient. If I can just hire 6 guys that have built this before, wow, you know what, I can spend time writing reports for my bosses, or working on my PowerPoint presentation that I have to get done for the board. That's that's not the path to innovation. That's not the path to, differentiation. So we need to, yeah, I think the message I would give everybody is overvalue talent, overvalue attitude, and be careful that you're not overvaluing experience.
Wow, great insight. So just a few things. Values aren't really going to change or
Mhm.
not very often, but
Yeah,
culture will. You've
yeah,
seen the business cycles. We're now going through a massive paradigm shift where cultures are changing. It's an opportunity to kind of rest on our values. Clearly, through the growth experience, you've seen a lot of mentorship and a lot of growth occur in looking for that continuity of the values, knowing that culture can change, but also the one piece of advice of attitude and aptitude, and not to overvalue experience. I think it's great. I think it's immensely helpful to people who are looking to do this, and a great opportunity for those who are going to work with you, I think, at Hatch to benefit from the experience that you've had. So I want to thank you again, Alim, for joining us today. You've had an incredible journey this far, and you are one of those rare individuals who's probably got a bigger future than past in terms of your leadership style and skill, or tenure, I believe. But what you have to bring to bear is exceptional, and we're the beneficiaries of that. So thank you.
Marty, thank you. I enjoyed the conversation, and all the best, and stay healthy and safe.
Well, thanks to Alim Somani, and please join us next week for another episode of Building High Performance Cultures. And in the meantime, if you want to learn more about the subject, go to waterstonehc.com, and may your futures be bigger than your past. Thank you.